obviously we're here in Manchester. What I'll do, I think, to start this off is get each of the panellists to kind of introduce themselves a little bit about their background. I thought it was very interesting that Oliver said, how do you follow C.P. Lee? In the keynote address this morning, of course, you follow him with C.P. Lee. So I'll ask Chris to go first, but just before that, I've just been reading this book, Paul Morley's The North, again quite apposite, seeing as though we're in Manchester. And just because I happen to be reading this bit, I thought I'd share this with you. I think, have you heard this? Paul Morley, famous music journalist in the 1970s, the NME, very much part of that kind of a wave of British journalism. His hero was David Bowie, and he was unable to meet David Bowie for a story he recounts here. He's talking about going to see Mark Bolan. I've seen him a couple of more times, and he had invited me to the Granada TV studios where he was recording his Mark series. His friend David Bowie was a guest on the show, but I had an appointment interviewing C.P. Lee of Alberto y los Trios Paranoias in Didsbury for the NME, and failed to turn up to watch the pair of them messing about and singing a new Bowie song called Heroes in what turned out to be the last few days of Mark's life. So anyway, that's why Paul Morley never got to see David Bowie.
Me.
C.P. Lee.
Yeah, well, he's dead.
So if each of the panelists would just like a few words to introduce themselves, and we'll go first with you.
I'm C.P. Lee, and I'm famous for being in a book by Paul Morley.
I'm Andrew Barker, and I'm not famous for being in a book by Paul Morley.
But
I am head of heritage collections at the University of Liverpool, and one of the things that we have are the archives of the three Mersey poets, those termed the Mersey poets, Adrian Henry, Roger McGough and Brian Patton. And I'm going to talk a bit about that and a bit about other things Liverpool related.
I'm Roger Bygort. I'm a Manchester-based freelance artist. I'm a director of the Wander Inn, arts organiser, and along with Simon, my friend here, we coordinated the Still Howling celebration of Howl last year in October.
Good morning everyone, or afternoon. Simon Warner is my name. I was born in Manchester, although I now work in Leeds. I teach popular music at the university there. A year or two ago, I published a book called Text and Drugs and Rock and Roll, Beats and Rock Culture. So I'm interested in the way the beats and rock music interact. And as Roger says, we had an event called Still Howling in this very room about 9 months ago. Thank you.
Yes, I'm Pete Brown. I began life as a poet and kind of rebel, beatnik type person, and more in love with music than anything else. I eventually became a musician, first of all a songwriter, and then a touring musician, which I still am. And in recent years I've returned to poetry and also do things like this, which I really enjoy doing.
I should add, of course, that Pete Brown is a late but very welcome addition to the panel. My name's Simon Morris, and I run the music journalism degree at the University of Chester. My interest picks up on what Simon Warner, I guess, discussed, in terms of there's still countercultural connections from the beat generation to the rock scene, and maybe even out to the rave scene, which was my interest in that kind of mixture of clubs and music and intoxication and all the things that spin around. And I spent a long time as a music journalist, so that's my kind of interest in travelling in the world and seeing different music scenes. I thought I'd kick this off with quite a general question for the panel. Do you think there's anything particular about the northwest of England here, we're linking up Liverpool and Manchester, that might have meant that the kind of the beat resonances were felt more keenly in this area? And I'm thinking particularly last week that Stockport, where I live in Manchester, voted Remain, Liverpool voted Remain. Maybe we've got more in common with many different things than we do with the rump of this country. But anything in particular about the northwest of England, why this stuff would have settled here?
slavery.
Right.
If you go back to before the American Civil War, the young people in the northwest of England, and particularly in Manchester, became obsessed with vaudeville shows, with the idea of the in fact, coon shows, if I can call them that. Emmett Miller and people like that appeared again and again at the Palace Theatre and the Odeon and this, that and the other. Then, in the 20th century, in 1926, the Manchester Jazz Appreciation Society was founded, which received jazz records 3 weeks after they'd been released in America. And they used to play them just around the corner at the Wheat Sheaf in Long Millgate, Thomas Street, where they'd play records by Blix Beiderbecke or Satchmo or whatever, again and again, to try and discover the meaning in them. Then, in the 1950s, we get the birth of the blues here in Manchester, and I'm going to say against Liverpool in a moment. And you would get people like Paddy McKiernan, who promoted the blues and gospel shows at the Free Trade Hall. No one else in England would take those shows. In 1963, he did. And a coach came from London with Jeff Beck, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Jimmy Page, all the way from London to Manchester to watch these real-life blues players. So people like Paddy McKiernan were promoting blues music, which became an obsession at the Twisted Wheel. And the Twisted Wheel became what Elton John described as the best gig to play in England because it celebrated black American urban music. If you go to Matthew Street now and look at all the names of the bands that played at the Cavern, there are very, very few black bands. Oh, I'm throwing the gauntlet down in the ring here. During the American Civil War, Manchester workers boycotted Confederate cotton. They marched in their thousands for 4 years and starved rather than work with Confederate cotton. Charles Dickens and people set up soup kitchens for them. In Liverpool, they opened a Confederate consulate.
Nah.
In Camel Head Shipyard, they built the Alabama. I'll sing you a song if you want. When the Alabama's keel was laid, roll Alabama, roll. It was laid in the yard of Jonathan Lead. Whoa, roll Alabama, roll. The Alabama was a Confederate blockade breaker. It sailed out of the port of Liverpool. It was turning to get back to the Confederate States on the coast of Cherbourg, where it was sunk by the USS Kearsarge, which had an African-American crew. Irony of the supreme mostness. And so, we have this dichotomy between Liverpool and Manchester of supporting the Confederacy, of promoting black music. It's interesting. The Beatles were more influenced by female singing groups than they were by Leadbelly. In Manchester, the R&B bands, who in 1966, the top 3 records in America were from Manchester, not from Liverpool. I rest my case. Thank you.
Well, I would throw the art schools into the ring here.
Yes.
Because Liverpool Art School and some of its denizens, and also Manchester Art School, which I knew a lot less. But I started doing poetry readings in a place in Liverpool, and inspired by 2 guys, one of whom had been a guy called Maldine, who was a wonderful artist, and we met them at the Maldine and this guy Johnny Byrne at the Bewley Jazz Festival. And they said, Liverpool is fantastic, you've got to come. And we went, absolutely, we're there. And we eventually, by various means, got there. And the influence of the art school dance, the art school bohemianism, British art school bohemianism was definitely an early element in the creation of the British, what you call the British beat scene. Which was not just poetry, but was writing of all kinds, and also art, and of course many people in Britain graduated from art schools to become very, very important musicians too in the earlier days, or the good days of rock, in the 2nd and 3rd generations of British rock and blues. And of course it's also, I believe, that people from Liverpool Art School in particular were featured in the famous article, which was either in the News of the World or the People, which was titled "The Beatnik Horror,"
People in 1960.
Yeah, that's right. And including the building in Gambia Terrace where Lennon actually lived, and later on Adrian Henry lived as well. So that was the beatnik horror definitely did originate partly from Liverpool Art School.
And I think it's also worth saying that if we go back maybe a little further in time, first of all, Liverpool and Manchester have had a great and historic rivalry running over many centuries.
Yeah.
But one of the things that this part of the world, the northwest of England, shares in common is certainly an Irish heritage, which has brought an air of the party and the crack and a life of enjoyment to both those cities. And they also say that during the Civil War, when the Puritans held sway in England, the northwest of England was the last remaining quarter of the Catholic rump, if you like. And so those traditions of maybe drinking, enjoying yourself, the sort of anti-Puritan behaviours fed into the world of entertainment later, the world of comedy, the world of music. And so there's quite a strong sort of a fertile soil to breed the entertainers who follow.
I'd just like to add the water. I mean, certainly from Liverpool's point of view, Liverpool faced towards America. Many of the families from Liverpool had members who sailed over to America. It was not unusual to, they were there one day, then they were off somewhere else. The whole Cunard Yanks thing of the 1950s and 60s, possibly overstated, I think, certainly in terms of the Beatles, they weren't really Cunard Yank benefit. They didn't benefit from Cunard Yanks, I don't think. But certainly the water, the ability to travel across, opened the world up, and facing away from the rest of the country, I think certainly made Liverpool open to.
And American blues records.
Yes, yeah.
And jazz records.
Yeah.
Came through Liverpool quite a lot, I believe.
Although there is an argument they also came through the air bases from during
Yes,
the war
they did
to
too.
Warrington.
Of course they did.
Just thinking about the first direct connection, it was the water that brought the beats to Liverpool. Kerouac in the Merchant Marine and Lawrence Ferlinghetti. I'm just wondering, Andrew, maybe if you could comment on the first direct connection between the Beat generation and these cities.
Well, I think, obviously, Ferlinghetti and Kerouac came to Liverpool during the Second World War, but it's because Liverpool was the opening face of England. You also had, back in the 19th century, you had Melville coming in 1839, you had Nathaniel Hawthorne spending 10 years, so the kind of precursors in many ways to what came the Beats had already established themselves in Liverpool and spent time. Ferlinghetti, obviously, the first thing many an American GI or a sailor would see of England was the Liverpool docks. He came through en route to D-Day. Kerouac joined the Merchant Marine, sailed on the SS George Weems, and spent time in Liverpool in 1943. And this is where I kind of take a knock back to Manchester from Liverpool. It was on his final day in Liverpool. He'd spent a couple of days in London at the Royal Albert Hall listening to Tchaikovsky, pieces by Tchaikovsky, meeting a couple of prostitutes en route, running out of money, then getting back to Liverpool on that final day in Liverpool, discovering what he termed later the beatness, and getting the inspiration for his life's work, the Deleuze legend, all of which is in the Vanity Deleuze.
Yeah.
So the whole beatness originated in Liverpool 15 years before another sort of beat.
Well, I was just reading the Vanity Deleuze again, because I remember from reading it the first time these kind of direct connections. And Jack Kerouac writes, "We sailed down the Irish Sea, laid anchor off Belfast, waited there for some British convoy boats, and crossed the Irish Sea that afternoon and night straight for Liverpool, 1943, the year the Beatles were born there. Ha ha ha." Is what he writes.
Yeah.
So he sees the connection,
Yeah.
and is amused by that.
He seems to have more time for the English during the Second World War than he later. He says somewhere that they tried too much to be like us.
Right.
Nah.
He also writes a couple of pages later about that journey from Liverpool to London. Boom, we go into the night lights of England. Bang, Birmingham, Manchester, call it what you will. And I'm just trying to work the geography of that, how you go Liverpool, Birmingham, Manchester. But let's forgive him that maybe. So any other thoughts about these very early connections and and through to the kind of, obviously, before we move on to the
Well,
big...
the thing that, you know, because one of the beat ethics was to find great people everywhere and to be impressed by it. It comes in on the road quite a lot, which got to me quite a bit in the early days, and to see people living in different kinds of harmony. And when I first got to Liverpool, I was quite amazed to see the relationship between the various populations, the Irish population, the black population, were all living at that point in the early 60s, late 50s, in a certain kind of harmony, and the Chinese too, which was very, very interesting to me. I didn't see that in London. And I was very impressed by the fact that there was this multicultural thing going on in Liverpool, probably before it really got to London as a policy or a feeling, you know. It was happening there quite naturally.
What's really interesting about Liverpool is it's two cities, and if you know the place, you understand there's the north end and the south end, and they're very, very different places. I mean, it's a great quote to you. The Beatles didn't just have to come from Liverpool; they had to come from South Liverpool because it's suburbia, it's more middle class, and you've got on the out part before you get into town, you've got Liverpool 8. Which is exactly the world that I think you described in that piece.
Up to a point, yes, and certain dotted things around the periphery of that. Yeah, that's right.
I'd like to just pick up on, Pete brought in Adrian Henry there, and just from an artistic point of view, a visual art point of view, you know, Henry was the person that introduced the idea of happenings, I think, in Liverpool, and actually, I think he did come over to Manchester as well to do introduce happenings at would have been Manchester Poly, I think, when it was the art school.
No, it was the art school.
The art school.
Yeah.
And that, just the whole idea of happenings coming in through that kind of route, I think is really important addition.
I refute that.
Oh, okay.
Adrian was external examiner at Manchester Art School. But when he came, the band I was in the 60s used to stay at Adrian's, and we were very close. Partnership with Andy Roberts and people like that. But the happenings were spontaneously being generated by a whole feeling of an alternative culture after 1966, and it kind of went out like missionaries from the Poetry Olympics that something should happen. And I was going to ask Pete if you can recall a poet called now he's got Dave Stringer, who was from Manchester, who ran a poetry magazine that was funded by the ICA, or the Northern ICA, Institute of Contemporary Arts. And he was active in 1966, probably even before then. And he was the founder of the Pennine Poets later on.
Don't recall it.
But the whole idea of inclusiveness of poetry. But the happenings were happening. I knew Adrian and Bill Hart. Very much, I would say, or arguably more important than Adrian. Bill Hart founded an organisation, not the Blue Coat, but there was another building. He used to hold happenings in Formby Hall, which he filmed. He's got hours of footage of all these happenings in the 1960s. So Bill Hart brought about, at the same time maybe as Adrian was doing things, but I think Adrian was more concerned with the Liverpool scene then as a performing unit.
1962, allegedly, I mean I wasn't there, but 1962 Hope Hall, the first happening, Adrian's first happening, was in the city.
Then I take back everything I've said.
But it's quite interesting because although they're very close, I suspect in the early 60s it was still quite a distance between the M62, so you didn't news didn't travel as fast as it would travel now.
And if we're still talking about sort of historical things briefly, the rivalry between Manchester and Liverpool, although they're only 30 odd miles apart, has been intense for certainly 100 years. We're talking about Liverpool having a view to the sea, it's on the Irish Sea. Manchester created its own waterfront by building the Manchester Ship Canal in the 1890s. This was to avoid taxes that were being imposed in the Liverpool docks on imported cotton. And so a 35-mile canal was built. And if you visit Salford in Manchester while you're here, there's an extraordinary, it's where Media City now is, where the BBC is based. But there are docks which are long unused as docks, but it gave Manchester a route to the sea. And out of that rivalry, Liverpool had been founded as a city in 1207. In 2007, it celebrated 800 years of being a city. Manchester, at the start of the 19th century, was just a tiny town on the map. It had very little significance. And it was only when the Industrial Revolution was seeded here, and with figures like Karl Marx visiting Chetham's library to learn about Engels' factories and so on, it was only when the Industrial Revolution was seeded here that Manchester could take on Liverpool in terms of population and ambition, I guess.
Yeah, I was just going to say, one thing people often forget is how rich Liverpool was until the first part of the 20th century. There was a great phrase bandied about, mainly by people from Liverpool, I imagine. Manchester, Salford lads, Manchester men, Liverpool gentlemen. It was the second city of the empire, and I think in part the reason it was open to things like beats and then the rock and roll is there's all these fantastic buildings, warehouses, big houses that were starting to crumble and not being used. They gave them opportunities to have things like the capital.
I wonder as we have Manx and Scousers present here, we should try to divide the conversation up a little bit. So if we think about Liverpool specifically, should we talk a little bit about that Beat to Beatles kind of trajectory? And we were talking before about Lennon famously had his comic book at school, The Daily Howl. What do you think about the relevance of that time-wise?
I'm going to be, I think, slightly contentious here because I've read, this was Lennon's nod to Ginsberg and Howl, and the times just don't fit. Lennon was writing a comic. It was very much, if you've seen John Lennon's In His Own Right or Spaniard in the Works, it was very much a daily comic book for his mates at school, Quarrybank School, with daft jokes about the teachers, things that were happening. And the earliest one, dated, this is Mark Lewisham, has done this, identified one from late 1955. Now the idea that a suburban boy in South Liverpool going to a middle-class boys' school was discovering stuff that was happening in San Francisco is a leap too far. But I think it's much more interesting than that, because actually what a great coincidence, at the same time these two seismic events were happening. Lennon was much more affected by Spike Milligan, The Goon Show, and the Daily Howl was just that, was a daily laugh, a howling of laughter. And that's what he wrote through the mid-1950s.
It's very interesting that you bring up the Goon Show, because the Goon Show, for alternative or anarchic-minded people growing up in the 50s, was absolutely essential. It was seminal. It was more important than almost anything culturally, and undoubtedly contributed enormously to my life, to the lives of people like Eric Clapton and Jack Bruce, who I worked with obviously, and to the Beatles. Without that, I'm not sure that Beats notwithstanding, Ginsberg and Co. notwithstanding, I'm not quite sure that any of the really great creative British stuff would have happened without the influence of the Goon Show. And I'd also like to mention, now that we're on Lennon, is that I do believe that when the poetry readings in Liverpool at this place called Streets, which was a kind of weird coffee bar in Mount Pleasant, and I do believe that Lennon used to attend them. Now, I don't remember seeing him there, but then I might not have known who he was anyhow. And it's worth mentioning that those things were started not by any Liverpudlians, but by Spike Hawkins, who was another great poet of our generation. And he was the one that instituted those poetry readings. And And then, as a result of that, the Liverpool poets kind of came out of the woodwork and became established. And of course, then you got this amazing phenomenon of Brian Patton's Underdog magazine, which was selling more than any other poetry magazine in the history of Britain, and mostly to young teenage women as well.
And if we're talking about poetry and the Beatles, we should certainly mention the Beatles, or some of the Beatles had attended Quarrybank School. Andrew just mentioned it. They were originally called the Quarrymen. They became the Silver Beatles. They became the Beatles. Sure. And then the meeting with a poet called Royston Ellis. I think you might have mentioned Chris when you were speaking.
Yeah, somebody told it from
That's right. Royston Ellis was a poet. Was he based in Liverpool? Was he?
He spent some time there in kind of May 1960.
I think he's from London.
He was, northwest London.
Not very good either.
So he lived in London, but had visited Liverpool, and he must have seen the Silver Beatles, or the Beatles in some incarnation, and suggested to Lennon that they should stop spelling the name of the band like the insect, but actually put the A in the middle, add the beat element, and the next thing, they were the Beatles with an A, and the rest, to repeat that cliche, it is history indeed.
That's a really interesting point, and it's kind of sometimes where you can get lost in history, because that has been debated. That. Yeah, there's a letter from March 1960, 27th of March 1960, Stuart Sutcliffe, and I'm pretty sure Royston Ellis turned up in May 1960, and Stuart Sutcliffe writes a letter where he says, my band, the Qua, and he crosses out the Qua and writes the Beatals, B-E-A-T-A-L-S, not Beatles as we know it, but Beatles. Then they did go through a process of Beatles, Silver Beatles, but they were originally the Beatles. That was Stuart's spelling. Lennon always preferred Beatles, and it was a pun. They thought Buddy Holly and the Crickets was this fantastic pun. Crickets, two things, brain game, insect, brilliant. We can have the same thing. But Royston Ellis was influential, but not in quite that way. He was the first person to mention them in London. There's a reference to them. He talks, I think he's interviewed in one of the music papers, Music Melody Maker, about this band back in Liverpool he wants to get support and called the Beatles.
All right.
And I think that there's also one sort of intriguing detail that I've never quite been able to get my head around. I'd love Pete or Chris or anyone to come in on this. There doesn't appear to be any link, as far as I can ascertain, between beat as a literature and beat group as an idea. Has anyone got any thoughts on that?
My thoughts are that at the beginning there was beat music, there was R&B, which became beat music.
Yeah.
And my esteemed colleague, Dr. Luntz, who's fallen asleep now, will acknowledge this. I'm trying to. That's all right. What happened in Manchester etymologically was that coffee bars suddenly became beat clubs. And it was not because of an influx of American poets, it was to do with rhythm.
Yeah.
So I'd love to see a link, but unfortunately I don't think it's borne out.
I don't think there is.
No, I mean also you've got to realise that in America and amongst people like myself, the early inspirations for creativity were coming from jazz, from American, black American jazz, largely black American jazz, and the whole atmosphere and culture around it and the behaviour of jazz musicians. It was not anything to do whatsoever with rock and roll or even the beginnings of rock and roll, although I personally was very inspired by people like Wynonie Harrison, who were early blues big band shouters, and who had wonderful lyrics and very subversive. What?
Don't forget Slim Gaillard.
And Slim Gaillard, of course, who appears in On the Road, was a jazz musician and comedian, and probably the hippest person in America. Someone I lived in London for the last 10 years of his life, who I met a few times. So those were tremendous inspirations. And of course Slim Gaillard not only was a wonderful comedian and lyricist, but like certain other very interesting artists, he invented his own language. He had a hybrid language. I don't know if you're aware of this. He had a language called Vaut, and which was a mixture of Yiddish, Armenian, Cuban, and various other things, resulting in titles like Yaprok Harisi, and he was a great hero of the early British beats. Most of us, certainly at the beginning, and I remember having a big fight with Ginsberg about this at one point, because I brought Ginsberg to Liverpool. I don't know if some of you will know that. And I had a big fight with him because I loved jazz, I loved black music, and I hated rock and roll to start with. And I didn't like the Beatles that much either to start with. And I said to him, this is fucking awful stuff, you know. Jazz is what's really happening. And he said, no, man, the Beatles are going to change the world. And of course he was actually right, much to my chagrin, you know. He was actually right. But at the same time, I certainly was very much more inspired by the jazz and the fringes of jazz, particularly by very hip lyric writers and inventors of language like Slim Gaillard and Wynonie Harris, and the writers that wrote for Wynonie Harris.
And there was a definite divide there, wasn't there? I mean, the Cavern was a jazz club. The Bill was opened as a jazz club in 1957.
Yeah.
I mean, the Beatles played there and ended up getting thrown off because they used to come on and say, this is an old one by Leadbelly called Blue Suede Shoes, and then played Blue Suede Shoes, and they ended up getting thrown out because Lennon was very much a rock and roller. He turned up to art college on the first day in 1957 looking like a Ted and acting like a Ted. He hated jazz all the way through his life. He hated jazz.